Welcome back, everyone. We thank the Vice Chancellor for being here for the final valedictory session. This will be the last session of the Golden Always. And I invite the speaker, Professor Georgios Varouxakis, and the chair for this session, Professor Jyotrimaya Sharma, to the stage. Professor Jyotrimaya Sharma, of course, needs no introduction. He's the Dean of the School of Social Sciences, a faculty at Political Science Department, as well as the conceptualizing designer of this entire series. So, over to you, sir.
No. Start talking. He so dislikes rituals. Good afternoon, everybody. Apologies for beginning slightly late, but we had this very engaging session the previous, before lunch. It's my great pleasure and privilege to welcome Professor Georgios Varouxakis to the university, to Golden Always, and to invite him this afternoon to give this lecture. Before I actually ask him to do so, a short introduction of his is in order. Professor Varouxakis studied at the Queen Mary University in 2006. He joined the Queen Mary in 2006. Before that, he studied MA in Legal and Political Theory at the University College London and did his PhD in History also from the University College London. He specializes in 19th and 20th century history of political thought and intellectual history with a particular emphasis on international political thought on nationalism, patriotism and cosmopolitanism, empire, and the intellectual history of ideas of Europe and the West, as well as attitudes towards EEC and EU. His most ambitious book is soon coming out, published by Princeton University Press. It's called The West, The History of an Idea. His earlier books include Liberty Abroad, J.S. Mill on International Relations, Victorian Political Thought on France and the French, Mill on Nationality, and Contemporary France, an Introduction to French Politics and Society. He is also the co-director of the Center for the Study of the History of Political Thought, and more significantly, the co-director of the Collegiate MA in the History of Political Thought and Intellectual History, which is jointly offered by Queen Mary and UCL. He has been a research fellow at UCL, a visiting research fellow at Princeton University, a senior research fellow at the Lichtenberg College, and he has also recently been a visiting fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. This is just a short introduction of somebody very distinguished and thoughtful. I now invite him to deliver this valedictory address of the 3-day celebration of social sciences. Don't forget, Golden Always. Good. I'll come up with questions.
Yeah. Thank you very much. That was overgenerous and hyperbolic. I thought hyperbole was a Greek quality, but Jyotrimaya may be Greek. Vice Chancellor Professor Rao, Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences, the School of Social Sciences, Professor Sharma, Convener and Head of the Department of Political Science, Professor Kailash, dear colleagues, fellow speakers, and students. I'm very, very grateful for your presence. I know everybody's exhausted. It's a difficult time after lunch. I have some thanks before I begin. I would like to thank, first of all, the organizers, obviously. First of all, Jyotrimaya, Sharma, for having had the clearly rash and bad idea to invite me to give a lecture. But most importantly, and obviously the convener, Professor Kailash, but most importantly also the volunteers. They have been heroic. They have been really heroic. The gracefulness and the charm and the kindness and the generosity with which they have been helping us on all sorts of things is incredible. And dealing with somebody as useless with technology and everything else as myself is a challenge they have been very gracefully facing. I met wonderful people here, so I thank them for what I learned. I learned an awful lot. And last but not least, I would like to thank the students who have been attending, besides the academics, the students. You heard your Vice-Chancellor's advice and did exactly what he asked you. You have been challenging the speakers. It's been impressive how many questions and challenges have come from the audience. So we all found it very inspiring, and we've been talking about it every day. Back to Jyotrimaya, I would like to thank him again for the invitation, for the vision to have this celebration. And to thank him for his scholarly, intellectual, and professional standards, which are exemplary and outstanding, his excessive and unique generosity in every respect, in every sense, and his sense of humor and unique wit, which is also a very important quality. Now, I remember the late Professor Douglas Johnson, professor of French history at UCL, was invited by one of his colleagues to give a lecture, and she said to him, "Can you speak for 50 minutes? Are you sure? All the 50 minutes?" And he replied, "My dear, somebody who does my line of work tends to like the sound of their own voice. I assure you, I do not like the sound of my voice when I hear it recorded. But unfortunately, that doesn't mean that I don't talk too much. So I will try to keep this short, not because I don't like to talk or don't have things to say, but because I'm extremely keen to take questions and have a discussion. So I will try to make sure I keep it shorter than it could be, but we'll see if I manage, Aspiration sometimes is a good thing, but it's not fulfilled. We will see. So, Jyotrimaya told me that I should try to discuss and reflect on the experience of writing my most ambitious book, and I will try to do that with a lecture. But given that there is a methodological focus to the whole conference, I gave a methodological title, but I will apply that methodological question that is in my title to the concrete question asked by my book. So your questions could be either on the methodological questions or on the West and the concept of the West and the history of the idea of the West, or anything related to either of them or both. As you will see, I will talk about both. Intellectual history, which is what I do, has been routinely criticized for being a Eurosceptic field, a Eurosceptic subdiscipline. The main reasons for that are more likely to be circumstantial and historically explicable than inherent in the nature of the subdiscipline. Practitioners of intellectual history tended to work on canonized major thinkers when the discipline began to assert itself and spread in universities some decades ago. The thinkers in question happen to be European and North American for reasons that can be explained and scrutinized. Meanwhile, in recent years, intellectual history focusing on other parts of the world, outside Europe or North America, has thrived, and it's ever increasing. And intellectual history, no matter what one may think of its initial Eurocentrism, can claim, much more than most other of history's subdisciplines, to have been transnational or transcultural, rather than national or ethnocentric. Every self-respecting lecture has to contain some quotation from Lord Acton, at least in the United Kingdom. So here is mine. Ideas are extraterritorial and pay no duty as they pass from land to land. End of quotation. Acton was right, of course. Ideas do not respect borders, and the study of their history cannot respect borders either. The question is, can intellectual history, besides being transnational and transcultural, be also global? Or should we limit our ambitions and acknowledge that it can and must be transcultural, but not necessarily global? Much depends on how one defines global, of course. And different definitions have been proposed in the last 2 decades. Some more literal than others, and some more clearly defined than others, and some more convincing than others, of course. Andrew Sartori, who is one of the people who initiated the debate, and he specializes in Indian history, Andrew Sartori and Samuel Moyn organized a conference 2009, 10 or 11, I can't remember, and a couple of years later it was published as a collective volume on global intellectual history, which started a debate that is ever growing and increasing in attractiveness and popularity, and more people are coming to contribute to it. So Andrew Sartori has said, to a great extent, global history has named a broad questioning of the Eurocentric, nation and civilization-centered and linear approaches characteristic of post-war historiography. End of quote. Now, another major contributor to intellectual history, analysis of intellectual history, its history and its varieties, is Richard Whatmore of the University of St. Andrews. I'm quoting from the last 2 pages of Richard's book, 2016, if I remember correctly, What is Intellectual History? ? In some ways, however, the notion, he's commenting on David Armitage's proposal that, or suggestion that intellectual history should and could deal with long-term subjects, longue durée subjects, and should not confine itself to very limited texts and periods as it had done traditionally. And as I mentioned yesterday at the panel, incidentally, he calls that serial contextualism, in the sense that you can use contextual methods on particular moments of a debate. And anyway, you can read more what he says than I can represent it. But he insisted on, he proposed that longue durée is feasible and doable, and he proposed it, and he wrote a book on the history of the concept of civil war in recent years. So, commenting on that, Richard Whatmore says, in some ways, however, the notion of the global is an idea at odds with intellectual historical research. Intellectual historians today are too often concerned with the recovery of local concepts and seek to uncover material that has been lost because of the dominion of national perspectives. Emphasizing global perspectives might appear a worse crime still, because the local and particular could inevitably be perceived from a much less immediate historical distance. So he's warning us that the enlargement of the circle may have a price, may involve a price, and that if we had been worried about how the national context was constraining our understanding, the global may make things even worse through spreading oneself too thin. Let's put it that way. I'm quoting further on from Richard Whatmore. From another point of view, to identify something as an object of global history is questionable because, from the perspective of intellectual history, everything is as potentially global as anything else. To assert a global perspective is therefore to state that one subject, rather than another, is of global significance. As Samuel Moyn and Andrew Sartori have argued, the danger is that we reaffirm the dominion of Western liberal ideas and mistakenly transplant them into foreign soil. At the same time, and as Moyn and Sartori's edited collection Global Intellectual History underlines, Intellectual historians can help in tracking the movement of ideas across borders and cultures. The result must not be a return to the study of the peaks of the mountain and neglect of the foothills, through focus upon the figures who alone enjoy a global reputation, whatever that means these days. The historian who has avoided these sins and has written what might be said to be a model for intellectual historians interested in global ideas is John Pocock. His Barbarism and Religion books cover the transmission of ideas across the Roman Empire and their history after the breakup of this empire, entailing the translation of arguments across the gigantic Eurasian landmass and their involvement across the Atlantic world and all the lands encompassing the British Empire at the end of the 18th century. End of quote. Whatmore is careful enough in his formulation. He does not say in so many words explicitly that John Pocock is the best global intellectual historian we have, but rather that Pocock's monumental 6-volume Barbarism and Religion offers a model for intellectual historians interested in global ideas. End of quote again. And that cautious formulation was wise, of course, of Richard, who was very close to John Pocock and in very frequent contact with him. Because Pocock was to write 3 years later, in 2019, he was to publish in a journal bearing the title Global Intellectual History, and edited by none other than Richard Whatmore himself, an article expressing clear skepticism about the possibility of there being such a thing as a global intellectual history. Its title is On the Unglobality of Contexts, Cambridge Methods, and the History of Political Thought. Don't worry, I'm not planning to quote everybody. Only one more person will be quoted. Duncan Bell. Duncan Bell, professor in Cambridge, contributed one of the essays in the volume edited by Sartori and Moyne. And in that essay, he raises some serious criticisms of the very idea, and meanwhile offers a potential definition of global intellectual history and a potential way in which it can be done, which I find very interesting. So I'm quoting him. What is the question to which global is the answer? He proposes to think about this question by reflecting on the possible antonyms against which the global is evoked. What is it the opposite of, he is asking. The first contrast Duncan Bell identifies is the contrast of the global with the particular, the local. The main target here is methodological nationalism, the view that the boundaries of a particular political communities set both the terms and the limits of inquiry. Bell's comment is that, I'm quoting, the criticism is well taken but limited. While there are indeed many interpretive questions that cannot be asked or answered adequately in a national or statist frame, there are others for which it may well be appropriate. It all depends on the question being posed. End of quote. His main criticism in this respect is that, I'm quoting again, exhibiting the same logic of foreclosure, methodological globalism mirrors the limitation of methodological nationalism, fixing the answer before the investigation begins. Second, as I mentioned already earlier when I quoted Acton, Duncan Bell also thinks that the challenge lands only a glancing blow on the field, for many intellectual historians already operate in an intra-regional and transcontinental mode. I will quote him a little bit more and you'll see why it will then bring me to the West. The second, perhaps more common antonym of the global is Western. I didn't keep the suspense for long, did I? The idea here seems to be that global intellectual history is configured as a challenge to the pernicious reduction of intellectual history to the intellectual history of the West, aiming to open the debate to a multitude of voices from previously disregarded locales, It represents an act of resistance against scholarly practices that reinscribe destructive North-South dynamics in the heart of the modern university. End of quote. Once again, Bell retorts, this is a welcome challenge, but here it is necessary to distinguish, he says, between disciplinary sociology and methodology. Forgive me, it's a longish quotation, but it's the last quotation, I promise. It is true that as practiced in European and American universities, intellectual history and political theory are dominated by Western intellectual concerns and movements. Incorporating other voices in pedagogy and research would reap considerable political intellectual benefits and would have significant implications for syllabus construction, hiring decisions, and publishing strategies. From this perspective, reconfiguring intellectual history is ultimately a self-dissolving enterprise. Global intellectual history would be rendered obsolete at the moment of its success. I've been quoting Duncan Bell so far. The result would be a new disciplinary constellation, he says, a suitably modified intellectual history. So, almost final quotation now. But even if the project to reshape the field in this manner were accomplished, it would not necessarily make the resulting scholarship global in any conceptually interesting sense, says Duncan Bell. Studying the intellectual history of India or North Africa, the circulation of ideas in Ottoman or Ming Chinese imperial spaces, or the political theory of Sufi Islamic scholars or Latin American liberation theologians, is no more global than studying the intellectual history of Germany, the United States, or Northern Europe, the philosophical cultures of the British or Spanish imperial metropoles, or social democratic ideologies in Scandinavia. The global, then, often seems to be a geopolitical placeholder, a term signifying not or not only Western. End of quotation. He gives an end note to this quotation, and there he says, and I reassure you this one is very short, the West is, of course, a highly problematic concept, but this helps reinforce my argument. The category, the West, should be an object of analysis, the focus of genealogies, not a spatial, S-P-A-T-I-A-L, yeah? Space. Not a spatial frame for demarcating it. End of quotation. At the very time Duncan Bell was calling for such genealogies, I was already working on one. It took time. As we have been discussing throughout in the last 2-3 days, writing takes time because there is no good writing, there is only good rewriting. So it took 13 years. But now it's finished, that genealogy. So I will, now is my most difficult task, which is to tell you a few things about what exactly it does and why it's important. And that is easier said than done. But I am relying on your questions because, as Professor Scaria said, if you don't challenge me, it means I'm not a thinker. So in order to save my self-respect and not hurt me, you have to challenge me. If you don't challenge me, it means I didn't give you enough material to challenge me through what I said. So with that in mind, I will keep it short, but I hope you will ask me questions and I will elaborate. So what's the big deal about it? I will read to you a very brief list of things that my book brings that might be surprising. And some of them I will give examples and elaborate on, some I will not, but I hope you will challenge me to say what I mean. My book may well challenge more or less everything its readers thought about the idea of the West. It will certainly surprise those who thought that it always existed, or at least existed from Plato to NATO, as the sentence goes, from ancient Greece to today. But my book will meanwhile challenge the assumptions of those who thought that the idea of the West must have emerged after World War II with the onset of the Cold War. There are many people who argue that and write and say that. It will I will make a parenthesis and digression to say we heard earlier about the importance of listening. Indeed, listening is terribly important. So the fact that it took a long time was salutary because I gave endless papers all over the world. And every time I went to talk about my subject, everybody was telling me what it was. And then I realized how serious my problem is. My problem is that the preconceptions of people about what the West is are so strong, because it's so ever-present in our lives, that I had a very difficult task explaining to people to try to unlearn what they have learned. But I hope those who will honor me with reading the book will find some of it convincing. So the book will also surprise those with more specialist knowledge who have read in the existing scholarly literature on the idea of the West that it emerged in the West in the 1890s or thereabouts. You will find dozens of people arguing that. Obviously, it's all in my endnotes. My book will most certainly give second thoughts to those who assumed that the idea of the West emerged in juxtaposition to Asia or Islam. It didn't. It will also present a challenge to those who thought, and have been told routinely in the academic literature, that the idea of the West arose to cater to the needs of high imperialism. Such readers will certainly be intrigued to read of the extent to which the first explicit, deliberate, and thorough articulation of the idea of the West emerged as part of a staunchly anti-imperialist theory and political program. Similar surprises await those who take for granted that the idea of the West inherently involves adherence to liberal democracy, rights, and individualism, and so on. The book will also take issue with the impressions of those who take for granted that the idea of the West had Anglo-America as its core and is simply an extension of the so-called Anglosphere. Far from that. The Anglo-Americans, the English came later than anybody else in Europe, and the Americans even later. As T.S. Eliot put it, the West, he wrote in a letter, the West is a subject about which everyone thinks he has something to say. As I was saying earlier, I was learning every time I talked to people about my topic. And my book is likely not to conform to existing preconceptions about what constitutes it. It is not a history of the West, but rather a history of what many different people have understood the West to be. That is, however, an extremely important history. I hope to convince you either now or some other day. The book endeavors to reconstruct the history of when, how, and why the West emerged as a socio-political concept, to what uses it has been put in the 2 centuries since its emergence, how many different things it has meant, and what the implications and repercussions of each of the different meanings are. The task is daunting, but rewarding, I have found. So, I hope I have intrigued you enough. I'm not going to go through all of these things, as I said, but I should say a few things, given that I have all these rather ambitious, pretensions or claims. So, to cut a very long history short, before you ask me, what about Edward Said and what you said about the East and Islam and Asia? Edward Said, I don't discuss Edward Said for a very particular reason. His work is irrelevant to what I'm discussing. I'm not criticizing it. Others have done that in terms of his scholarship and what he missed and so on. But that's not the point. The point is something else. The Europeans were very happy to other the East, whatever they meant by that, and to create a self-identity for themselves by orientalizing the East, what he says, very influentially and very correctly, of course. But they were happy to going on calling themselves Christendom or Europe while they were doing that. They were not calling themselves the West in the 17th and 18th century when they were othering the East. That's what I'm trying to say. A new term, and to that extent more and more surreptitiously but surely, a new concept arose when some people started feeling the need for a term to differentiate themselves from others who were also European and also Christian. So my joke in the past, when I was giving lectures on this topic and I still had the enthusiasm of the neophyte, was people assume the West was invented by my so-called ancient Greek ancestors. Actually, the West was invented against my so-called medieval Greek ancestors, the Byzantines, the Eastern Roman Empire. The West, as a political concept, as a political term, arises in 395 Christian era, when the Roman Empire is divided between the two sons of Theodosius. The Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire. The Western Roman Empire, within, there are different interpretations of when exactly it collapsed, but very soon it collapsed. Whether it's a century or a bit less or a bit more, we all know the Western Roman Empire was conquered by Germanic invaders, so-called barbarians. The Eastern Roman Empire continued in an uninterrupted existence, albeit in the last century's very precarious existence, until 1453, uninterrupted with some salt, because Constantinople was conquered by the Western Christian brethren during the Fourth Crusade in 1205. So the Byzantine emperor went further somewhere else in Asia Minor. But a few decades later, the Byzantines, the Eastern Roman Empire, conquered Constantinople again, and they continued until 1453, when it was conquered by the Ottomans. So, what I'm trying to say is the following. If you're an ambitious Frankish Germanic prince, one of these so-called Germanic barbarians, and you unite a major part of Western Europe that used to be part of in the past of the Western Roman Empire, and you are very ambitious, what do? Well, we know what he did. Charlemagne, Karl the Grosse, in 1800 was crowned by Pope Leo III in Rome, Emperor of the Romans, Imperator Romanorum. Except, nobody called him Imperator Romanorum except himself and the Pope, because there was another empire that was the Roman Empire in Constantinople. Conveniently, it was the empress was a woman, Irene of Athens. For a couple of years, they could delegitimize it by saying a woman cannot be emperor, but a couple of years later, she was replaced by a man. So, what in practice happened is that what Charlemagne could claim was that he was the successor to the emperor of the West, the emperor of the Western Roman Empire. Are you following me so far? Good. And then later, when the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, which, as Voltaire famously has reminded us, was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, when it came up and lasted obviously until Napoleon abolished it, it called itself the Empire of the West. But little by little, also its rivals in Western Europe, like the French, they were calling themselves the West. They were also claiming the mantle of Rome and of Charlemagne. And by the end of Napoleon's rule, it was part of French national mythology that Charlemagne was a French king, although he spoke German and he was a Frankish Germanic invader, of course. And as usual, the French won. I mean, we don't call him Karl de Grosse in English. We call him der Grosse. We call him Charlemagne. Anyway, so that's the West in history. Now, in the 18th century, you will challenge me very soon. Avi is there sitting and about to challenge me. And you will say, but wait a minute, Condorcet in the esquisse, in the sketch of the history of mankind, in Epoch 6 and 7, it's full of references to the West. Yes, but why? The West is a historical period. He talks of the West at that time, in previous centuries, as opposed to the Eastern Roman Empire or the empires further east. When Condorcet talks of himself and his time and the supranational entity he belongs to, his civilization, his culture, his society, what does he call it? Europe. Condorcet was the most passionate Americanist. He was very keen on America. He wrote books on the lessons of the American Revolution for Europe. He wrote at least 2 books on America. He doesn't talk of Europe and America as the West, as we would anachronistically assume. The concept didn't exist. It wasn't there. It was Europe he talks about. Now go to Gibbon, the enormous work of Edward Gibbon, on whom, of course, the whole work of Pocock we talked about earlier works around. Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire contains the word West hundreds of times. I haven't counted, you don't need to count. But go and see how. Same thing. As a historical period of that part of the world. It's a historical period and a geographical entity. But when somewhere he intercepts an essay on whether we here now, in his time, in the 18th century, are in danger of being conquered by barbaric invaders the same way as the Romans were, he says, in so many words, explicitly, again and again and again, we, who is we? Europe. So the contemporary entity, supranational entity to which Europeans thought they belonged, they called Europe in the 18th century. Before the 18th century, they called it Christendom. Europe was used a little bit, but not much. Christendom, of course, continued to be used, but was more and more replaced, or the references to Europe, both because of secularization and for other reasons we can discuss, but I have no time, was used more. But what I'm trying to say is there was no West. The West was a historical term and a geographical term. And of course, it referred also to the Catholic Church versus the Christian Orthodox Church of the East, the Greek Orthodox and the Russian Orthodox churches and so on. The West is invented because of the elephant in the room, or rather, the bear in the room of the Congress of Vienna, 1815, Russia. Can I invite you to remember what happened in 1815 and in the years after? Russia had managed to become part of Europe, both culturally and politically, in terms of the geopolitical composition of Europe, since the time of Peter the Great in the early 18th century. So after that, everybody talked of Russia as a European country, as a European power. But Alexander I, with his charm, with his connections, with his spiritualist quests, with his friendships with various intellectuals and various ladies in various parts of Europe and so on, had managed to become very popular, as Isaac Nakimovsky's book shows recently on the Holy Alliance. So in 1815, Russia is not just part of Europe, Russia is at the center of the table. Alexander dominates the discussions. After his role in defeating Napoleon, he dominates the discussions, aided by various very important and interesting advisors and ministers and so on. And as you know, he creates very soon the Holy Alliance. If you read the Holy Alliance's declarations, they more or less, he insisted on calling it a Christian nation. The nations that were united in that alliance, he calls one Christian nation. So the Orthodox Russians were not just now part of Europe, they were in the middle. Now that was anathema to a number of people. If you are Joseph de Maistre, the Catholic, conservative, diplomat and philosopher who had spent 14 years in St. Petersburg as the ambassador of the Kingdom of Sardinia, you didn't like that very much. Or Saint-Simon, or de Bonald, all sorts of people in Western Europe were thinking of a Europe that was Charlemagne's Europe, Carolinian Europe. The old empire of Charlemagne plus the Iberian Peninsula and Britain. That part of the world had gone through Catholicism. Obviously, some of it now was Protestant, but it had gone through Catholicism for many centuries, had gone through feudalism, had a cultural unity and historical unity, according to many people, that they could see they belonged to it, and they called it Europe. But now Europe included Russia and the Ottoman Empire. So if you thought of Europe geographically, you also had to include the Ottoman Empire and the lands in between. So to cut a long story short, during the Greek Revolution, already in the 1820s, there are people who start talking of Greece as a God-sent opportunity. If one of them said in France, if the Greek Revolution had happened, we should have had to invent it, because the Ottoman Empire is moribund. We're not in danger from the Ottoman Empire. Our problem is who will succeed the Ottoman Empire. And these people were worried that the Ottoman Empire would be succeeded by Russia, which of course was trying very hard to go to Constantinople for religious as well as geopolitical reasons. So already in the 1820s, there are absolutely explicit evocations of a Western alliance, of a Western federation, in order to protect Western European countries from Russia, which was too big and too dangerous for them. Now that, as I said, it was already explicit, but the person who put his stamp on all this was the founder of the master science, as we were reminded in the first lecture, sociology, Auguste Comte, the French philosopher Auguste Comte, founder of sociology, founder of positivism, founder of the religion of humanity, inventor of and coiner of various terms like altruism and much else, was already planning. He was one of the prophets of Paris who were planning the future of Europe and the reorganization of the world after the cataclysm of the French Revolution. He was one of many. But he had some very radical ideas. Thankfully for you, I promised to keep it short and I won't go to the details, although you may ask me, and then you'll be blamed for what will happen to the rest of you. But one of the parts of his plan was that the nation states should auto-destruct, with France first, and be replaced by small territorial states of the size of Tuscany, Sicily, and so on, Belgium, where industrialists and bankers would run the economy, because he was very close to Saint-Simon, had been Saint-Simon's secretary for 7 years, and he was thinking in terms of the industrial development of the future that would lead to the abolition of conflict, because the idea was we will exploit nature in the interest of humanity as opposed to fighting with each other for resources. But there would be a separation of temporal from spiritual power, like in the Middle Ages when the Pope was the spiritual leader of the whole of Catholic Europe, the Europe that these people have in mind, which is not the Europe of the Orthodox Christians beyond. And that the role of the Pope was very beneficial, according to Comte, because in those times nobody else could do it, because he kept in their toes the rulers, the secular rulers. There are things you cannot do, says the Pope, and you don't, no matter how powerful you are. And he kept the moral and spiritual unity of Western Europe despite its political fragmentation. These things he had found in the book Du Pape of the same Joseph de Maistre I was talking about earlier, published in 1819, written in Russia before he left St. Petersburg 2 years earlier. So Comte says now, there is no God. We don't need to believe in God. We have now reached a stage of scientific explanation. Nietzsche speaks explicitly of this. He's known for saying that God is dead. Nietzsche says Comte was right. Of course, Comte came with the idea before me. But the trouble with Comte is he out-Christianed the Christians, because he created the religion of humanity with all sorts of details, which would be a kind of secular religion that would keep us all together in a different way without a belief in a supranational God. We would worship humanity itself in its present, past, and future. It's a very interesting idea, and the only thing I will say before moving on is that he tried to make it really universal. So the equivalent of saints, people to whom a day or a week or a month were dedicated, depending on how they had benefited humanity, in his opinion, included Mohammed and Buddha and various. It was not only Europeans, it was not only Christians. On the contrary, he wanted to dissociate his entity from Christianity. Christianity should not interfere with it. It was part of its past. Catholicism was important as part of the history that created that unit, but now it had to be a very different entity. Of course, you'll probably go to sleep now thinking Georgios has gone mad. We had been warned by Jyotrimaya. We knew he's a bit idiosyncratic. So what? I would agree with you, except historians will remind you, Comte is now forgotten by everybody except Michel Houellebecq. I challenge you to go to any novel of Michel Houellebecq in the last 30 years and not to find references to Kant. Kant scholars asked him to write a preface to a book in 2003, and he wrote there why Kant is terribly important and so on. I won't go on. But, and there are reasons for that, which again, you may challenge me to explain more. But though he's forgotten by most people except Wellebeck, Kant was an extremely important figure. So just one example, Karl Marx was writing in the 1860s to Engels, I have to read that Kant guy because the English and the French make so much fuss about him. But after he read him, he decided, I'll stick with Hegel. I prefer Hegel. The comparison speaks for itself, though. Everybody was comparing Kant to Hegel. That's the level of influence and the level of ambition. He was offering a worldview, an explanation of the whole of history, and a proposal for the whole of the future of humanity. More ambitious than Hegel's. It doesn't mean he was right, but he was proposing in every detail what will happen in the next 7 centuries. The reason why I'm saying all this is he is the first person to have come up. Nobody has written on the West, its history, its meaning, and its future as a political and as well as moral and spiritual project and so on, as much as Kant. Even Spengler. Nobody has written as much as Kant. But Kant was a very idiosyncratic person, and as he was growing older, he was becoming more and more. Kant was Eurocentric and Francocentric and Mediterraneocentric, and he was from Montpellier, from the south. Kantocentric, egocentric, to the extent that more or less everybody who has written on the idea of the West routinely says it was invented in the interests of imperialism. It goes together with imperialism. It's part of its DNA. It was invented because the imperialist powers needed a concept to justify imperialism. Nonsense. They were quite imperialistic before the concept was invented, and they called themselves Christians, and they were going to save the souls of people in the Americas, as you know, and the Pope was blessing them. They didn't call themselves the West, and they also called themselves Europe when they were doing that. Kant wanted immediately the abolition of all empires. He wanted immediately the liberation of Algeria. The British should leave India immediately, because imperialism and violence and force and conquest were atavistic, and in the current stage of the world's progress that he considered as the positive stage, these things are complete anachronisms and unacceptable. So armies should be abolished. There should be a flotte occidentale, a Western navy that would police the seas against piracy. Anyway, he went into great detail, as I said. He invented a flag and so on. But the reason why I'm going on a bit about him is that whatever else it was not imperialistic. At the same time, remember I said, those who say the West is inherently liberal, no, Kant was illiberal. Kant thought parliamentarism, democracy, and these things are nonsense. We need hierarchies, and so on. So it's a complex picture. Do I mean, therefore, that the West was never used to justify imperialism? I'm not as silly as that. I'm saying the first articulation and the invention was for completely different purposes. Later in the 19th century and in the 20th, it was used for all sorts of purposes. It's being used for all sorts of purposes right now, and I guarantee to you it will go on being used to all sorts of different purposes in the future, because it's a very attractive thing. It gives people, when they say Western civilization, gives them some kind of gravitas, some kind of credibility. And there is a number of political sides that do it at the moment. In the past it was other sides. In the future, who knows who it will be. But it's a very tempting term. And Kant went for it exactly because it had clearly emotional, religious, cultural baggage, affective baggage that would appeal to people. It meant something to them because historically it was there and had some meaning. So instead of going for a more abstract term, he went for that term. Others tried to name the same civilization with different names, and you can find them in the book, and failed abysmally because they didn't have any historical or cultural resonance. So that's why, despite his flaws, he had a point there. Now, I made a fundamental mistake, which I always do. In order to explain why he's important, I wasted my lecture on him. In my book, Kant is 1/3 of chapter 2. The book is composed of 10 long chapters, So the story then continues and follows the story to the rest of the world and to today, including Michel Houellebecq's close analysis of Michel Houellebecq's novels. I will, luckily for all of us, not be able to go through any other thinkers or periods or original ideas in the book. I will spend a very few minutes just connecting now all this, well, what I just tried to sketch, with the notion of global intellectual history with which I started. Is it global? Well, let's look at it. I use texts in 5 languages, primary sources. The focus of my book, I decided that it will, obviously, it's already overambitious and almost insanely ambitious. So I decided from the beginning I will only study the West as a self-description. When do people within the West, within what everybody else sees as the West, start describing themselves as the West? Because if you look at people somewhere else calling somebody else the West, that always existed, not least because of geographical reasons. And yet, I realized very quickly it's not so simple. So, when I thought I was clever, as we do initially, I thought I will not include the Germans, and that will save me a few years, because the Germans were ambivalent about whether they are Western or Eastern, or European or something, Mitteleuropa or whatever, until literally the 1950s with Adenauer and the Westbindung of the Federal Republic and its westernization. Then, before that, they were ambivalent. There were Germans who insisted they are Western, but they were a minority most of the time. Thomas Mann's Betrachtungen eines Unpolitischen, Reflections of a Non-Political Man, 1918, is not an aberration, although it sounds like rumbling of a man who is very angry, because he was very angry against his brother, who was pro-French and pro-democratic and pro-Western and was wishing for the Germans to lose the war. But he was more typical of German thought than his brother Heinrich. According to him, Dostoevsky is right. Germany has always had this mission in its history to be the protest against Rome, the protest against the homogenizing imperialistic Romans. And now who is Rome? The West. The West Europeans, French, English, and the Americans are the West, the successors of Rome, and we are the protest, the resistance against them, says Thomas Mann. He changed his tune by 1922, but this was typical, as I said, and he was not alone during the First World War. Why am I saying this? Because I promised methodology. Your sources change all your plans. So very quickly I realized not only was I right to suspect from the beginning, yeah, but how can I do 20th century American political thought and geopolitical thinking after 1940 or the 1930s? They're all Germans, they're all German migrants. Of course I was right about that. And a young man called Henry Kissinger plays a crucial role in my Cold War chapter as a Harvard student, PhD student, not when he became minister. He was already very interesting in 1950 as a student. But not only was I right that you can't ignore the Germans because the Germans are the American thought of the late 20th century, but I realized you can't ignore the Germans for a number of reasons, because everybody was influenced by the Germans in the 18th and 19th century, and B, not only 20th century America, but 19th century America is completely dominated by German thought as far as my subject is concerned. So I have a chapter called Ex Germaniae Lux, Light from Germany. Ex Germaniae Lux, how did the idea of the West reach America? Which shows how the first uses of the West in America were either by German migrants who moved to America and started living there and trying to promote it, and explicitly complained in the middle of the 19th century, we need a term for our civilization. Why don't we have an agreed term? Which proves my point that there wasn't one. And also by Americans who went to study in German universities. Göttingen, Halle, Berlin, Heidelberg. No, if you were a self-respecting graduate of Harvard College and you were ambitious, you had to go and do a PhD in Göttingen. The first American PhD was Edward Everett, Göttingen, and many, many others, and so on. So these people, of course, come to America and start talking of the West, translating books of their professors like Herren and so on. So that was one first surprise. Not surprise, but something you learn. So, of course, Germany now and the German lands are probably the most interesting part of the book, instead of not being included. Another thing that proved completely clear from the beginning is you cannot focus only on Western thinkers, whatever you mean by that, because there are non-Western thinkers who become part of the Western conversation. So you may not be surprised to hear that Rabindranath Tagore gets a lot of attention in my book. Gandhi as well, but Tagore particularly so, because Tagore was a global celebrity, literal global celebrity from the 1910s to his death. In the interwar period, during the war, when he went around the world giving lectures on nationalism, and after the war, Tagore was revered in Britain and in Europe and America. Count Kaiserling, the Baltic Count who had Schule der Weisheit, a school of wisdom in Darmstadt in Germany, hosted Tagore for a week. The brilliant historian of German Orientalism, Susanne Marchand, calls the phenomenon furor orientalis. There was a German East mania after the First World War, which had been building up for decades before, but after the First World War, it became very conspicuous. Everybody had to comment on it. Some Germans were complaining about it. And in France, there was a conservative Catholic nationalist intellectual called Henri Massy, a member of the Action Française group of Charles Maurras. And he wrote a book, Défense de l'Occident, in the 1820s. And the book is an attack, of course, on Oswald Spengler and his prediction of the decline of the West and so on. But it's also an attack on Tagore. He constantly attacks Tagore and his influence and his destructive influence on Germany in particular. And in the end, he adds an appendix on Rabindranath Tagore. And yet, arguably, if Western civilization's greatest threat was Tagore, Western civilization was quite safe. It's safe, it seems to me, because Tagore was very balanced and very measured in what he was saying and proposing. African American thinkers are Western thinkers. I'm not calling them non-Western. They are Western thinkers. Some of them don't think they are. Some of them very much think they are. And in the end, the hero of the book, the thinker who gets more pages than even Kant, is the African American novelist Richard Wright, who spent his last 15 years of his life in the obsessive quest to understand Western civilization and how he fits in it. Because, as he said disarmingly in a conference in Paris in 1956, it's not a choice. I was born there, I'm Western, and yet I'm not fully Western, because I'm not allowed to be fully Western, but I understand the West. But I also understand the non-West, because of the way I'm treated. I understand the frog perspective, as Nietzsche, I think, called it, how it is to be looked down upon by somebody that you are down there and they are looking from above. So these are some of the perspectives that are included. I, of course, as I warned you, could go on and on and on. Final thing, since we're in India, another of the things that are in the direction of the global are the alliances. So the alliances between African American and Francophone black intellectuals centered in Paris are absolutely astonishing, and how they exchanged visits, information, newspapers. So the Negro World, the magazine of Marcus Garvey's movement, had a French and a Spanish section in every issue, because they had articles from the brethren from these parts of the world in order to exchange information and so on. The alliances of Du Bois with Indian intellectuals. He wrote a novel based on an Indian princess and so on. So another dimension is these alliances of the people who feel they have to resist what they see as imperialistic imposition and or maltreatment at home, like the African Americans and so on. So all these things are global to the extent that global means anything. But that's not my claim. My claim is not that my book is global intellectual history because it deals with people in various parts of the world, although other people do that. It can only be called global in the sense in which the same Duncan Bell explains in his essay that I mentioned earlier. You will be spared the quotation because I promised to keep this lecture to some limits. But basically, the idea of dealing with it's not spatial. It's not about whether. Well, I will read the quotation because I'm too tired to explain it properly, and he puts it very eloquently. So I'll read what he says. What then of the global? I suggest a tentative answer by sketching two main lines of argument. I skip the first. I'll go to the second, which is about intellectual history. Second, the global intellectual, his argument is that global intellectual history can be characterized as a mode of social inquiry that focuses on articulations of globality. This argument is a version of what Moyne and Sartori label an actor's category approach, but it is not synonymous with studying a consciousness of the globe or representations of the planet. Viewing globalist intellectual history as a species of world-making does not assume or prescribe any particular spatial scale. Rather, it concentrates on enunciations of universality, on attempts to cognitively encompass a given world of whatever physical scale. According to this perspective, then, global is not a geographical designation or a synonym for non-Western, but instead denotes a perceptual scope, the perceptual scope of an argument or other act of imagination. So he means the people I'm studying, in my case, the authors who articulated ideas of the West, of course, they were thinking of how that fits in the world. For example, Kant envisaged the West as not only being the most advanced part of the world that has to organize itself in a new way, he envisaged it auto-destructing, dissolving itself after a few centuries, when it has reorganized itself according to its prescriptions, and the capital, which of course would be naturellement in Paris, according to him, would move to Constantinople, because the West would abolish itself, and now it would become the Republic of Humanity, and of course the capital has to be in the city between East and West, Constantinople. So these are articulations of the global, of the universal, which don't necessarily mean the whole globe, although in Kant's case it does. But to that extent, you can call all sorts of projects global, even if they didn't have the reach of Kant. Kant, by the way, since I told you he was more important than we think now, he's still, there is still a proof in the flag of Brazil. If you look at the flag of Brazil, you will read Ordem e Progresso. Ordem e Progresso is order and progress, the motto of positivism. Why? Because the Republic was established in 1889 by Kantist positivists. I thank you for your patience. I apologize for my broken voice, but we talked about embodiment a lot yesterday and today in bodies. The spirit is willing, but the body is weak. I haven't slept much, and I have a cold, but I am extremely keen and strong to take questions. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Georgios, for this hugely illuminating, informative, thoughtful, and entertaining lecture. Your humor was infectious. If in the course of speeches, the number of times I have been mentioned, if that could go into my citation index, I would be a happy man. But that apart, thank you very much for this. I now invite questions. I see one hand already up. Josefa?
Hello, hello. Yeah, thank you so much, Georgios. Because you look quite exhausted after this, I'll keep it very short.
I'm now beginning.
Okay, okay. So I hope the questions will energize you. So the question that I had, I'll keep it short. So I want to just know, first of all, what is the term that Comte uses in French? Does he use the term West or Occidental? And if he does, and I think in your talk you brought up around 4 terms that could be used to characterize this part. First is, of course, a prehistoric, the prehistory of the West would be Christendom. Then there's Europe. Then there's the West, and then there's Occidental. And they all have very different kind of connotations. Europe is a kind of a geographical space. Christendom is based on a religious kind of a categorization. The Occident is based on a solar metaphor, and also counterposed to the Orient. And the West is a directional and a kind of spatial reference. So I just want to ask, first of all, is the term that Comte uses Occidental or West? And if it's the West in French, then what is the difference between using that specific term and a term like Occidental or... Yeah.
Thank you. Brilliant question. L'Occident. And it's not directional for him. For him, it's historical. He's consciously and deliberately saying and explicitly saying this part of the world has developed since the time of Charlemagne, so 9th century, as a unit. These 5 nations, the French, the Italians, the Spanish and Portuguese, which he calls the Iberian, he calls them nations. He means linguistic groups. They are not nations in our sense. The Germans and the English, and their colonial offshoots, their settler colonies in Australia, North America, South America, important for him because they are Latin and therefore they put France in the center. And 2 exceptions, 2 countries in Eastern Europe, although they're in Eastern Europe, have to be included in the West. Poland, because it has been Catholic for 1,000 years and it's part of the West much more than the rest of the Slavs. And Greece, because of ancient Greece's influence on Rome. So even Comte makes that exception, although Comte didn't like the Greeks. So these 5 great nations of Western Europe have been called l'Occident historically, so that's why he calls his new entity l'Occident, because it's based on their common trajectory, which brings them together culturally, and they are more advanced than the rest of the world in terms of how close they are to scientific and intellectual developments as he sees them. But you're raising a very interesting question, because in Germany the terms can be different. Westen, Occident, and Abendland can be confusing, but although German scholars have emphasized that Westen is very recent and mainly 20th century, and in the earlier centuries it was always Abendland, I have not found that, to be honest. I have found Westen being used early 19th century by the Göttingen historian Heeren a lot. So both terms I take to mean the West. Although some German historians make the distinction that Westen applies more to the narrower West of the democracies that started with Britain, France, and America, and Occident is the more historical West and so on. So in Germany, the distinction of the term is important. I will not abuse the floor more, but you give me an opportunity to say Comte not only used the term, he invented a new term. I mean, he used a term that was there, but he also coined a new term to describe the identity of these people, occidentalité, westernness. He said, John Stuart Mill wrote to him and said, you are wrong to criticize the English so much as nationalists. Yes, the English are insular and ethnocentric, but the elites of the British, the educated, are more cosmopolitan than any Europeans. Comte replied, I don't care for that vague cosmopolitanism that puts the English and the French on the one hand and the Turks and the Chinese on the other in the same category. What we need is an intermediary identity, an occidentalité, a westernness, so that the nations that are close culturally should build together and then join the rest of the world. So he had a plan for expansion later or integration later. So the terms are important, you're right, very important. Thanks.
Any questions? Professor Suri.
I just wanted to ask you,
One minute.
I think there's nothing like global and local. It's all who is talking about this. The Israelis, the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, Indians, Chinese. At different points of time, they thought they were global. It is somebody else calling you as local. So it is a myth that you create. And it is self-belief also sometimes that you are global. The Greeks believed that they were the universal, the Athens, the Omphalos was at the center of the universe. So the Buddhists believed that Gaia was at the center of the universe. So the Chinese. And I think there is no ideal sphere in which these ideas clash and then global emerges. It is all power that mattered. And self-belief, creation of a myth, coupled with the power of weapons that made what is global. So there's nothing like, because every individual, what the name, thought that he is at the center of the globe. There is actually, every point on the globe is a center because it is round. And so I think when we think of global and local, are we saying that today that global means that various localisms come together, synthesize, and something emerges out of it? Or are we saying that a particular idea which has a global, which stands for global well-being, should become global? Or should we say that there is a continuous confluence of these ideas and something evolving that takes the humanity forward? So what exactly is that? Is the West ready, whatever West you think of, ready to take that in that sense? Or still they are deconstruction of the West that I welcome, I congratulate you for doing this. Is that they are recognizing this, or is it just another way of imperialism of an idea?
Sorry, can you repeat the very last sentence?
Is it just another form of imperialism, or are they...
What are you?
No, not the West.
You're challenging it. I appreciate that you're challenging it, and we require more people like you.
No.
But the question today is that when we talk of global today, we know that what America is doing today now, Trump says globalization is bad, whatever that means. Because when it is not working in their favor, then they say, no, not globalization.
Okay.
Yeah, I think...
Yeah, I think the point's well taken. I think another question will take along. Thank you. Ajay.
Yes. Hello? Yeah.
You just proved I'm a thinker.
Thank you. Thank you very much
Your
for the
definition.
talk. I found it very, very stimulating. And I just had 2 or 3 questions. I just had 2 or 3 questions which are connected. One was about, in the US, in the Americas, the word Christendom gets to be replaced by the term white. And partially that's in order to deal with the fact that Christians seem to include all these Haitians and all these other people of color. So what does one do, right? So white comes to replace it, which makes me wonder, what is the racial dimension of the term West, if it does have one? And second, what is the career of the term white in Europe? I mean, maybe you've written about it, maybe others have written about it, I don't know, so I'm just curious.
Thanks very much. Oh, sorry.
There's one more question.
Yes.
I like pairs of 3. Yeah.
Hello. Yeah, so nice book which is going to come, and I will read about it, West, the history of ideas. And you hinted some very good arguments, like how West is not in a juxtaposition to Asia or Islam, or either non-Western thinkers who are the past of the West. You talk about Tagore, but you didn't talk about Gandhi. I want to, because I have a discussion with Josefa also on how Gandhi was, in a sense, anti-colonial or proper, which is not be called a subcontinental philosopher. So I want to know more about the Gandhi and in the idea of regarding the idea of the West. And second, Du Bois wrote a novel with Indian Prince. I work on princely state, so wanted to know more about that novel. That prince.
Which novel?
Du Bois.
Yeah.
Du Bois.
I mentioned it, yeah.
Neither.
I can't comment. I'm sorry. I can't comment more than to say, I mentioned it already. It's not relevant to the concept of the West, but it's relevant to what I was talking about earlier. He's seeing the struggles as joined, and he became more and more global as opposed to American. In his earlier stages, he was concentrating on the racial conditions in America, and after the First World War, more and more, he saw the problem as more global, as international, and he started the Pan-African Congresses as of 1919 in Paris and several others, exactly in order to bring together people from Africa, and then later he started having alliances in India and China. And he was used by the Chinese Communist Party, by Mao, quite a bit near the end of his life, when he became an overtly communist and joined the Communist Party and so on. Before you went to that, excuse me, I warned you that I will need help. Before the novel, you asked about
Gandhi.
Gandhi is interesting because if you look at how he uses the term Western civilization, he has a rather clearly restrictive meaning for it. He says it's 100 years or rather 50 years old. He means post-industrial revolution. He is against modern civilization. His problem is modern civilization. The Europeans were much better when they were Christians, and since they stopped being Christians and became modern and industrialized, that's what he's particularly critical of. Tagore says similar things, but in a different tone. And somebody I discuss a lot in the book is a French Indologist, a specialist of Indian religions, called René Guénon, who converted to Islam and became a Sufi and ended his days in Cairo. And he had a very similar idea. He was constantly saying, I have nothing against Western civilization when it was a normal civilization, when it was Christian. The problem with, my problem is with modern Western civilization. There is an anti-modernity in thinkers like Gandhi and René Guénon, for example. Tagore is much more complicated because he's more nuanced than that. Although he says some similar things about Christian Europe and it's how it affects the morality of Europe. Now, the second question. White, yes, right. Exactly. It's you are giving me ammunition because there are very respectable scholars who say that the West was simply a substitute for whiteness because whiteness was not working. You have just proved why I'm right because they concentrate on America. It's the Americanocentrism of scholarship and to an extent the British Empire. It's the Anglophone, the domination of scholarship by Anglophone concerns and the Anglosphere that leads people to do that. Whereas my story is much longer and it's a much more Francocentric and Germanocentric story. And as I said, the Americans and the British join much later. They don't use the term and they start using it. I follow who uses it and what has been their itinerary. And it's always people who have lived in continental Europe and spoke German and French or were from those countries. So, and you are helping me to clarify something else. All these are overlappings. People have told me so many times, what about capitalism? Well, first of all, China is capitalist now. Capitalism has been seen by many people as one of the things that characterize the modern West. It's not the same concept as the West. It's overlapping with it. Europe has overlapped with the West an awful lot, and in some parts of the history, very closely. And some other parts, the whole point is to differentiate between the two, and so on, Christendom and so on. Oswald Spengler has a long footnote in the introduction to his Der Untergang des Abendlandes, the decline of the West, where he says, in so many words, I'm not making it up, the word Europe has to be abolished from politics and history, because it has led to this enormously detrimental misunderstanding that has led people to think Russia is part of us. It goes on and on and on and on. The Abendland, the West, has a meaning. Europe has no meaning. And he goes on to say, so the greatest thinkers of ancient Greek Greece came from the Asiatic coast, the Asia Minor coast. Were they Asiatics and not Greek? I mean, it doesn't make sense, he says. Europe is a geographical expression, not a culture, whereas the West is a culture in his opinion. I'm not saying he's right, I'm saying for these people, the differentiation of the two concepts was crucial. That's exactly why Kant was talking about Europe and European from the 1820s until the 1840s, and I have followed in detail the letters through which he starts saying Européen ou plutôt occidental, European or rather Western. And by a year later, he uses only Western, and then every book he wrote and every circular he sent, because he created the whole movement and the whole republic, was headed by the motto République Occidentale, Western Republic. So, overlapping but different concepts. So, there is this quote, this saying in Heidegger on language. It is when the word is invented that the concept becomes a concept. The thing becomes a thing. Words matter. That you use that word and not the other means you exclude somebody, include somebody, and so on in ways that you cannot do if you use Europe. And that's why it's crucial. Of course, now there is the problem that the term Western civilization is used routinely by Western supremacists in America to claim that legacy for themselves and to say that that's what they're defending. But many people that I quote in the book say, call it out. Allowing a term to disappear, to be owned by the wrong people because it crossed their lips and you don't like that, means you let the bastards grind you down. Claim it and explain that it doesn't mean that, or it doesn't. It has meant all these other things and so on. I could go on about Christendom, but the same thing. Kant and his followers are very explicit. The West has also the advantage that it dissociates what we are talking about from Christendom and can include all sorts of people who have different religions and can treat them with respect. And this brings me to your question. It depends on who we're talking about. So in the Kant, with all his flaws, and that's, again, if you knew how excruciatingly boring his prose is, you would understand that there are good reasons why I spend so much time with him, and be grateful that I interpret him to you in proper prose. But Kant, with all his flaws, tries to be open-minded. So he doesn't say global, the West is global. He doesn't say the West has to dominate. He says it's more advanced. It's the most advanced part of the world. It's more advanced technologically. That's what he says. But it's a matter of time. Obviously, I know the objection immediately, so the others have to be on the waiting room of history. But he says they will join when they want, and only through help and sympathy, not through force or conquest and so on. So he tries to treat the rest of the world with a degree of respect and reciprocity that was unprecedented in the 19th century. I mean, have you read what Marx wrote about the British Empire and its future in 1853 in the New York Tribute? Some very, very scary things. I mean, in the sense the English do it out of selfishness, the English are very greedy, but they are doing the work of history because we have to the Indian village communities are anachronistic.
No, can I come in now, because there was a second part to Professor Suri's. There was a political part to the question. So there was a clarificatory theoretical part, and there was then the political part.
Yeah.
The political part of the question was: is there enough soul searching in the West where the tag of global is not something that's imperialism masquerading as globality?
Thanks very much. Thanks for clarifying that, because it's very crucial. I have not myself used the word global in tandem with the West. I'm using global in terms of methodological discussions on global intellectual history. I have to be careful how I will put this, but on the contrary, I would say if there is imperialism in the use of global, it's imperialism by scholars who describe their work as global because it sounds better. I mean, quotation mark imperialism. I mean, it can be a little bit overambitious to call your work global. That's why I'm very careful not to call my history global. It's transnational and transcultural. The term can be applied only in the restricted sense of the people I'm talking about. Some of them think of universal projects. That's what I tried to say. Now, is there enough soul searching? There is nothing but soul searching. I mean, the opposite might be the problem now in the West, that people, what's the word? How shall I put it? There is nothing but soul searching. So, in more recent scholarship or in more recent debates, what is interesting is the Fukuyama versus Huntington debate. So, of course, there are many problems with Huntington, but there is a misunderstanding because Huntington proposes to the West to be more humble, to be more, what's the word? To be more realistic, but also more epistemically humble. He says the West is not a universal culture and can never become, and should not try to become. It should learn to live with other civilizations that will be more and more powerful and assertive, and it has to find a way to live with them. He doesn't propose clash of civilizations. He warns that it might happen, and he warns the West not to think that it can become universal. So I'm not here to defend Huntington, whom I criticize in terms of his obsession with religion, and therefore his definitions are distorted by that. But compared to the Fukuyama model, which was the Western model will prevail everywhere, he was much more down to earth in the 1890s.
Okay.
The person who declared Western civilization universal was V.S. Naipaul, but he was criticized by many people, including Huntington.
Okay, so I want to take questions from that part of the globe. Yeah, I think it's the front benches mostly.
Thank you, Professor, for your illuminating talk. I'm interested in the discipline of that global intellectual history and what is happening in nowadays Europe, like Britain returning to the interest of the British people, especially the English people. That kind of politics been playing out in Western Europe. Now French also wanted to retain their nationalistic French identity. It's the same within far-right groups in Germany wanting to return to their German identity. So how you would locate, your talk is very interesting in terms of global and intellectual. So how you locate with divisions happening within Western Europe in relation to this global and intellectual, but also the concept of the West.
Well, that's very interesting.
After you finish dressing,
Sorry,
you can get back to...
I have already explained my attitude to these things, and I have a call because of that.
You have your own.
Sorry. Yes. If I understood your question, I can't predict the future. It's not my subject in a way. Whether these things change, so the only thing where I have a strong view is that there are endless surprises as to how the West is defined and whether it is or is not relevant. These things change. So, for example, I finished the book before the American election. We all knew what to expect, but I didn't want to speculate. I can speculate now that depending on who has President Trump's ear, America may become completely anti-Western or completely indifferent to the concept of the West, or may become very assertive. We don't know. I mean, his previous incarnation was to leave NATO and the West didn't matter, isolationism. But we all know, it depends on who is closest to him and who tells him what. If America were to completely withdraw, I can see an opening for France. If I were Emmanuel Macron, I would be already building my speeches about the Occident having been already centered by France and so on, and I would be reading Varouxakis very assiduously in order to build my speeches.
Are we?
I will send him the book.
We want a photo opportunity of you both together. That was really fascinating, and I look forward to the final product. Just about the methodology, I wanted to press you a bit about in what terms you would define what you've been doing. I mean, you mentioned David Armitage and serial contextualism. Is that the best way or the best term to adopt? Or, I mean, because to some extent, pardon my blasphemy, it sounds not too far from Arthur Lovejoy's, unit ideas, or in his case, the Great Chain of Being, which is actually a very good book and a much better book than what, the usual introductions or footnotes, that's the old mode of the history of ideas. But it seems to me that it's closer in the sense that it travels through different intellectual contexts and different geographical contexts and tries to find out what people meant by a particular term and who brought it where and so on. What we don't get there is this sort of Cambridge contextualism of mapping the different, today we would say institutional, that's not in Skinner, but institutional, linguistic, political context that the term could have had, and then saying why these people opted for the West. Is it because, what were the alternatives? Is that the sort of thing you're doing, more kind of something between Lovejoy and Armitage?
Okay, I'll take another question and then you can. The gentleman there. No, let him sit. Oh, no, please sit if you want to.
Hello, so my name is Rohit, Department of History.
Your name, and you'll have to hold the mics.
Look at it,
close.
otherwise we can't hear.
Okay, so my name is Rohit. I'm from the Department of History. So as Sir tried to debunk the idea of West that people had, and scold Edward said irrelevant, and did the exact same thing that Edward was doing.
You have to hold it in front of you, otherwise
okay,
we can't hear.
You hold your.
As Sir tried to debunk the idea of West that people had, and called Edward said irrelevant, and in a way did the same thing what he did. My question comes, most of the post-colonial writers or intellectuals are coming from the global south. Even though they're working in the global north, their origin can be traced from the global south. So how are these ideas taken in the global north? Like, do they accept it or challenge it?
Thank you very much.
Global South, post-colonial writers of the Global South, their critique of the West, how is it received in the North?
Well, in many ways, obviously, Frantz Fanon's Les damnés de la Terre, The Wretched of the Earth, was prefaced by Jean-Paul Sartre, who strongly approved it. He outdid it, so many people now say that he presented the book as much more in favor of violence than it was, because he wanted to articulate his own critique of Europe. And he says in so many words, Fanon is not addressing Europe. Europe is finished. He is not interested in Europe. He's interested in his brethren in the rest of the world, and so on. So that's an example of how they become part of the debate in Western Europe. And the Algerian Revolution, of which Fanon was, of course, the most famous, one of the most famous contributors, plays a crucial role in changing something that I have. There are many themes in the book that, as I keep saying since yesterday, can only make sense through the longue durée that I adopt. So one of the things that surprised me was the persistence of Francophilia. France could do no wrong for Du Bois. France was very popular with African Americans and also with the majority of Francophone black intellectuals in Africa and the Caribbean. They had a soft spot for France. That changes with the Algerian Revolution. The way, the violence, the terrible violence involved changed that. But until the 1950s, including Fanon in an earlier book in 1952, he says, what's all this negritude stuff? I want to be French. I want to hang out with Sartre. So that's an example. I would have more, but I have no time, alas. Avi, thank you, Avi. That's great to clarify. The methodology I adopt consistently and consciously and explain in the conclusion is Nietzschean genealogy. I take at least as it is interpreted by Raymond Goyce, the Cambridge philosopher. So I don't think this is the right time for me to go through it, but in the conclusion I explain why, and only in the conclusion can I do it, because I give examples to people and say, you see this? This is how it works, and so on. So I follow the different layers of meaning that have been deposited on top of other meanings and how they struggle and how some of them come back. Now, to address your question, I spend most of the time in the book relating the different thinkers. And so the people, although they live in different countries, they know each other. They read the previous ones. So it's not a comparison between people who have not heard of each other. Remember, I made a lot of Houellebecq. I had my reasons. I tell my readers in the last section of the penultimate chapter before the conclusion, remember Guénon? Look what he makes of this in the novel Submission. Remember Comte? Remember de Maistre? This is why the story matters. And I end with a quotation from Czesław Miłosz, the Polish poet, who exactly stresses how these different layers of history come back and they never disappear, they just transform themselves into different forms. So thank you for helping me clarify that. So I follow uses of the idea, uses of the term, but if I have a methodology, and I hope I do, it's genealogy.
Thank you. Any question? One last question there, probably. Yes, please. Identify yourself, please.
Hello, sir. Thank you for an insightful lecture. Actually, my question is, do you think colonialism is a precursor to globalization? And also, what's your viewpoint on concept of modernity? Do you think modernity is westernization in disguise?
Thank you very much. The former is more difficult to answer because historians have discussed so much meanings of globalization, and there are so many theories as to when it started. So it depends on what you mean, because some people find globalization in much earlier centuries. So to that extent, even before colonialism, some people think there was globalization. I don't have a view in the sense, there are specialists who have much more interesting views than me. The second one, you see, I warned you, I have dementia momentarily. The second part of the question.
Is globalization the same as modernization? No? No, say it again.
Yes, that's the best. Primary sources.
I got it wrong.
Primary sources. Thanks very much. Yeah, well, that's what many of the people I studied thought and said, and many of them contested that and insisted no. Again, I hope you understand, I use people because they're interesting in the debates I discuss. It doesn't mean I agree with them or sympathize with them or not. That's another question, and you need to buy me a drink for that. For my own views. My own views, well, I do have some views in the conclusion. I don't avoid having views, but on this question, Huntington is interesting because he insists the West was Western long before it became modern. Western civilization is not modernity. So one of the most influential thinkers in the late 20th century insisted, no, they are not the same thing. The vast majority of people identify them. I said Gandhi would mean the same thing between Western civilization and modernity. Guénon doesn't. He says there was a West which was fine, it was a normal civilization. In modern times, it has become overweening because it wants to encompass everything. It encroaches on other civilizations. If it becomes modern, normal again, and doesn't want to convert others to itself, I'll be happy with it. That's his attitude. So it depends on which of the thinkers. What do I think? Who am I to have views? I am just describing other people's views, on that issue.
Okay, that brings us an end to this lecture, the Valedictory Lecture. Thank you so much for this wonderful lecture.